The coldest night of the decade found her outside the door. A Lakota chief lit his fire for her. The wood was green, that's the first thing. I'd split it myself 3 days before, from a cottonwood that had died standing along the creek bank, and I knew when I swung the maul that it was too fresh. The ring still damp inside, the smell of it more like river than like smoke. But the storm was already laying itself down across the northern plains like something that had made up its mind, and I had no other wood and no time to find it. So I split what I had and stacked it on the covered side of the east wall, and I told myself it would do. It mostly did. The fire fought me all evening, kept wanting to die. I'd get it going and walk away and come back, and it would have shrunk to a handful of coals with the wind working in through the gap under the door and stealing what little heat the room had managed to hold. So I stayed near it, sat on my heels and kept feeding it, smaller pieces first, and when I had a decent bed of coals, I'd lay on something bigger and wait. Outside it was getting serious. I'd been through cold before, born to it, raised to it, fought in it. But this was the kind that announces itself like a changing of law, the kind where the temperature drops so fast you can hear the cottonwoods crack along the creek, a sound like a rifle shot every few minutes, the wood splitting itself from the inside because the water trapped in its cells is turning hard. I'd heard 3 of those cracks since sundown, 4 maybe. I was not expecting company. I had not expected company in a long while, if you want the truth of it. My name, the name most men used for me then in that country in that season, was Running Elk. My father had given me that name when I was 4 years old because he said I ran like one. Straight and without waste, he said. Not fast. Fast isn't the point. Elk don't run fast, they run like they mean it, and they don't stop, and that is the difference. I kept that name because it fit something real, and because my father was a careful man who chose his words the way a good tracker chooses his ground, one step at a time. I was 47 years old that winter. I had been chief of my band for 11 years since my Uncle Hollow Bear went to sit with the old ones. The band was not large, 32 people, and in that country in those years, 32 was a number you watched carefully. Some winters it went down. It almost never went up. The government had its ideas about where we were supposed to be, and we had our ideas, and those 2 sets of ideas had been in a long argument that the government was winning slowly, the way water wins against stone. You don't see it happening, but one morning the stone is different. That winter we were camped in a bend of the creek, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a low ridge to the north and west. Good ground. I had found it myself. The band called it my place, though I didn't own it any more than I owned the sky. Some of us had canvas tents and some had built small log shelters, and I had built one too, low-roofed, sodded against the outside walls for warmth, a fire hole dug in the center of the floor with a tin stovepipe I'd traded for the summer before sticking up through the roof. It wasn't beautiful. It did what it needed to do. I was the only one in it who was not blood. My wife Bright Morning had died 4 winters before of something that started in her chest and never left. We had no children who survived past their 2nd year. There was a boy. I don't talk about the boy much. I'll say only that he had his mother's eyes and my father's hands, and that he would have been a good man. Some things are not given to you to carry in words. So it was me, and the fire that kept wanting to die, and the wind coming down from Canada or wherever wind comes from, and the sound of the cottonwoods cracking. Then something else. At first I thought it was a branch. The wind would take things sometimes and throw them against the walls, sticks, dirt, once a bucket from old Joseph Thin Horse's camp, though he never admitted it was his. But this sound came twice, 3 times, and it had a rhythm that branches don't have. A knock. I didn't move right away, not because I was afraid, because I want to say puzzled. No one knocks on a door in a storm like that unless they are desperate or stupid, and in my experience, those 2 things share more territory than people like to admit. I got up from the fire, pulled on my coat. It was a heavy canvas coat with a wool lining that I'd bought from a trader in the fall, and I remember that when I opened that door the cold came through the gap like water through a broken dam, just flooded in, and the fire behind me guttered and nearly went out. She was on her knees in the snow. Not standing, kneeling, her arms wrapped around herself, her face down and her hair, dark hair, loose and frozen at the ends, hanging forward. She had a blanket around her shoulders that had collected maybe 2 inches of snow on top, which told me how long she'd been outside before she found my door, or before she got to the point of knocking. Maybe she'd been standing out there working up to it. Maybe she'd fallen. I don't know. She looked up at me. Blue eyes. I noticed that right away, which surprised me. Not that blue eyes are rare, I'd seen them plenty on traders and soldiers and missionaries. I noticed them because of what was in them, which wasn't fear exactly. It was something past fear, past the place where fear is still operating in the normal way. She was past calculating risk. She was just alive, still, barely, and looking at the light behind me. I said in English, "Get inside." She couldn't right away. Her knees weren't working right. So I reached down and got my hands under her arms and lifted her, which was easier than it should have been. She was light, and not in a way that spoke of health, and I brought her in and pushed the door closed with my foot and got her to the blanket I kept folded beside the fire. She was shaking so hard I could feel it through my hands. I got the blanket around her and added 2 pieces of green cottonwood to the fire and crouched there feeding it, not looking at her, giving her a moment. Some people need a moment. When you've been that close to dying, the world is very loud for a little while, everything in you still screaming that you are alive, and having someone look at you while that's happening is not comfortable. After a while the shaking changed. Still there, but different, less like something breaking apart and more like something settling back into itself. She said, "Thank you." Her voice was rough, frozen through and then thawed partway like the rest of her. I said, "Don't thank me yet. I've got green wood and the fire is arguing with me about it." She looked at the fire. Then she looked at me. I don't know what she saw. A man crouched on his heels in the firelight, probably not what she'd been hoping to find out there in that country. But she nodded like it made sense. "I can help with that," she said. I looked at her, said nothing. She unwrapped herself from the blanket, slow and careful, like she was inventorying what was still working, and she leaned forward on her hands and looked into the fire. She studied it the way you'd study a problem you'd seen before in a different form. Then she said, "Do you have any fat, grease of any kind?" I went to my food box and brought back a tin of lard I'd been using for cooking. She took a small piece of wood, a stick of kindling, and ran the end of it through the lard and worked it into the base of the fire where the coals were hottest. It caught clean and burned yellow and bright, and the green wood above it, having that steady heat underneath it now instead of just fitful coals, finally made up its mind. "You know fires," I said. "My father was a blacksmith," she said. "Spent my whole childhood keeping his forge alive." She looked at the tin of lard, then at me, then handed it back. "Sorry, I should have asked." "You solved my problem, keep the lard." She almost smiled. I could see it starting and then deciding not to quite arrive. Some part of her still wasn't sure what this was, what I was, whether any of this was safe. That was sensible. It would have been sensible anywhere. Out here in that winter with the kind of night she'd had, it was extremely sensible. "My name is Clara Voss," she said. "Running Elk." She nodded again, accepting it. Some people get a look on their face when I say my name, a kind of pause, a recalibration, some decision happening behind their eyes about what they're dealing with. She didn't have that look. She was too tired for it maybe, or maybe she just didn't have it in her. I got her a tin cup of the broth I'd had warming at the edge of the fire. Elk broth, good and strong with some dried root in it. She held it in both hands and didn't drink right away, just held it, getting the warmth from the cup into her palms. I watched that and felt something, some small thing shift in me. Hard to explain. Not quite tenderness. Something more like recognition. The way she held that cup was the way a person holds something when they have been without warmth long enough that warmth itself is the thing they need, before they can get to any kind of nourishment. She was wearing a man's coat over what looked like a woman's dress, both of them wrong for this weather, and boots that were not going to keep anyone's feet through a plains winter. Her face, now that some color was coming back into it, was maybe 30 years old, maybe a few years either side of that. She had a cut on her lower lip that had dried over, a day or two old, and a bruise high on her left cheekbone that someone's knuckle had put there. I didn't ask about those things right then. There's a time to ask and a time to let the fire do its work. She drank the broth, all of it. When she finished, she held the empty cup the same way she'd held the full one and stared into the fire. "I left 3 days ago," she said, not explaining exactly. More like talking to herself or to the fire. "I thought I could make it to Faro Station before the weather came. Everyone in Holt said the weather wasn't going to be bad this year. The old-timers said it, so I believed it." She paused. "I walked a long way today." "Where did you sleep?" "In a ditch, under some brush I pulled over me." She looked at me sideways. "I'm harder than I look." I said, "I don't think you look soft." She took that in, set the cup down carefully on the dirt floor. "My husband is in Holt. My former husband, I should say. I left because there wasn't any other option left that I could see. I tried the other options. They didn't work." She touched the bruise on her cheek, brief, almost unconscious. "I have an aunt in Faro Station. I just need to get there." "Faro Station is 40 miles from here in good weather," I said. "In this weather I wouldn't take that journey." She was quiet for a moment. "How long will this last?" 3 days minimum, could be 5. I've seen it go a week." She closed her eyes just for a moment, then opened them and looked at the fire and said, "All right." That was all, just all right. No argument, no panic, no asking me what she was going to do. She put it in the category of things that were true and moved on to whatever came next. I understood that. It's how I try to operate. When a thing is what it is, arguing with it is just spending yourself. "You can stay here," I said. "This is the only shelter I have to offer. You can stay by the fire and sleep there, and I'll give you what food I have. When the weather breaks, I'll take you north on horseback. Faro Station in a day." She looked at me straight, not suspicious exactly, more like she was taking real account of what I was saying, all the way through it, not just the surface words. "Why?" she said. I thought about that. It was a fair question, I said, "Because it's cold and you're here." She looked at me a little longer. Then she said, "That's a good enough reason." She slept that first night curled near the fire on the blanket I'd given her, with another one folded over the top. I sat up tending the fire for a long time, longer than I needed to probably, listening to the wind outside, trying to find a way in and failing mostly. The cottonwoods had stopped cracking, got cold enough that there was nothing left in them to freeze. Around what I figured was 2 in the morning, I lay down on my own blankets on the other side of the fire and looked at the ceiling and thought about things I hadn't thought about in a while. I won't say what they were specifically. Some things aren't for saying, but I will tell you that the sound of another person breathing in that room, even a stranger, even a woman in trouble, even across a fire, was a different kind of sound than a room without it. I'd forgotten that. 4 winters alone, and I'd forgotten the particular texture that gives to a room. I didn't sleep much, kept the fire alive. That was my job that night, and I did it. In the morning she was already up when I opened my eyes. The fire was burning better than it had all night. She'd worked the lard trick again, found where I'd set the tin, and she was sitting cross-legged in front of it with her boots off, rubbing her feet with her hands. She looked up when I moved. "Good morning," she said. "Your feet," I said. "Let me see them." She hesitated half a second, then held them out. I crouched in front of her and looked. The toes on her right foot were the color of old wax, not black, not past saving, but not good either. I went to my box and got the rendered bear grease I kept for skin and started working it into her feet, her right foot especially, the toes most of all. It's not a delicate process. You're trying to get the blood moving again, trying to convince the skin that it's not dying. I used my thumbs and the heels of my palms, and I worked from the arch up to the toes and back, and she sat there with her jaw set, not making a sound, which told me it hurt considerably. "Tell me if I'm hurting you," I said. "You're helping me," she said. "That's not the same thing." I worked on her feet for probably 20 minutes. When I was done, the color was better, more pink than wax. Not good, but better. I'd seen toes lost to less. I wrapped them in a piece of wool cut from the edge of a blanket I didn't need whole, wrapped them separate, the way you're supposed to. "You do that like you've done it before," she said. "I've done it before." "For yourself?" "Once. Mostly for others." She looked at the ceiling, then back at me. "You're the chief here. Your people told me to knock on your door. An old man, he must have been 80 years old, he came out of one of the other shelters when he saw me, and he pointed at your door and then went back inside. Like that was all there was to it." That would be Joseph Thin Horse, I thought. Joseph Thin Horse, who never admitted the bucket was his, who was 83 years old and still got up before me most mornings, and who did not waste words or gestures on things that weren't necessary. "He made the right call," I said. "He trusted you," she said. "Without thinking about it, that was something to see." She paused. "What I mean is, I could tell from the way he pointed that he didn't wonder whether you'd turn me away. He just knew you wouldn't." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I set the bare grease back in its place and put another piece of wood on the fire. She ate breakfast with me, dried meat, and the last of a cornmeal I'd been working through, made into something like mush, not particularly good but warm. She ate all of it without commenting on the quality, which I appreciated. Outside, the wind was still working. You could hear it finding the gaps around the door and along the peak of the roof, and talking through them in a low, constant note that changed pitch when a gust came through. The temperature, when I cracked the door for a moment to assess, was still falling. Not a good situation outside. Inside it was all right. She asked me that first full day about the band, not prying, more like genuine curiosity, the kind that comes from paying attention. She asked how many people, how long we'd been in this particular camp, whether this was our permanent ground or a winter camp only. I answered her straight. 32 people. 9 winters we'd been coming to this bend of the creek. Winter camp, but not so different from how it always was. She asked about the government arrangement. I told her the truth of it plainly, without heat. The truth was complicated enough without heat. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "That's a hard way to live." I said, "It is what it is." She nodded. "You said that last night in a different way." I looked at her. She had a memory for things, that was clear. "When I told you the weather would last 5 days, I said, and you said all right." "Yes, that's the same thing, accepting what's true." She looked at the fire. "I've been trying to get better at that. My father was good at it. My mother wasn't, and I take after her more than I'd like." She touched the bruise on her cheekbone again, that same brief unconscious touch. "My husband, my former husband, he wasn't good at it either. Things that were true, he'd just argue with them until he convinced himself they weren't true anymore. Then he'd be angry when the truth kept being true anyway." She didn't say more about it. I didn't push. The second day the cold got worse before it got better, which is how these storms usually go. I went out 3 times, once in the morning to check on the horses, once in the afternoon to check on the elderly ones in the band, once in the evening just to make sure nothing was about to fail. Each time I came back and she had the fire better than I'd left it. She had a talent for it, I decided, beyond just knowing the lard trick. She understood what a fire wanted, which is mostly oxygen and patience in the right alternation. On my 3rd trip out, when I came back, she had rearranged the room slightly. She'd moved the food box to a better position, closer to the fire's warmth without being close enough to spoil anything. and she'd swept the floor with the broom I hadn't touched in longer than I wanted to admit, and she'd found where I kept my spare blankets and refolded them in a way that would let them dry out properly from any moisture they'd collected. She hadn't made it into something, hadn't announced it, just done it. I stood in the door for a moment looking at the room. Then I came in and closed the door. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," she said. "I was cold and bored and it needed doing." It had needed doing. I said nothing more about it. She asked me that evening to teach her a few words of Lakota, not as a novelty. She explained it straight. She said that since she was staying here among my people, she'd rather be able to greet them properly than stand there not knowing what to say. She said it felt rude, not knowing the language of the place you're in. I taught her the greeting, the way you say good morning, the way you say thank you, the way you say the food is good, because Joseph Thin Horse's wife walking alone would bring us food the next day and she'd want to be able to respond. Clara Voss was a fast learner. She repeated things once, twice, and then they were in her. She had a good ear, which not everyone has for a new language, and she wasn't embarrassed by making mistakes, which is the real obstacle for most people. That night she asked me about bright morning. I don't know how she knew there had been someone. Maybe there are things a room tells you. Maybe there are things a man's silence tells you. I had a pair of bright morning's moccasins on the wall, I knew that. I'd put them up there after she died and I'd never taken them down. Maybe that. I told her about bright morning. Not everything. The shape of it. The chest sickness, the winter, the end of it. I told her that bright morning had been the kind of woman who made everything she touched better without appearing to try, and that I had not understood how much of what I thought was my own competence had actually been her, until she was gone and I could see what was left without her in it. Clara Voss was quiet for a while after that. Then she said, "How long did it take before you could stay in this room without it being painful?" I said, "I'll tell you when it happens." She looked at me. I wasn't sure what she was going to say to that, but she just said, "Right, okay," in a very quiet voice and looked back at the fire. Walking alone did bring food the next morning, like I'd expected. She brought a pot of something with turnip and dried buffalo meat in it, enough for several people, and she looked at Clara Voss with the careful measuring look that Walking Alone had been using on people for 60 years with great accuracy. Clara Voss said the greeting in Lakota, not perfect, but not bad, and Walking Alone's expression did something small but definite, like a door opening just a crack to let some light through. They couldn't speak to each other beyond the greeting, but they managed anyway. Clara helped Walking Alone with the pot, took it from her because the old woman's hands were hurting in the cold. I could tell that, and apparently Clara could too, and set it by the fire, and she and Walking Alone exchanged something wordless about the temperature of it, and then Walking Alone left, and Clara stood there looking at the pot. "She's remarkable," Clara said. "She's carried more than most people will ever know," I said. I could tell. She looked at me. "Can you tell her I said so?" "I'll tell her," I said. "She'll be pleased." On the fourth day, which was the third full day of the storm, she asked me about the camp. Not just the camp, the whole question of it, the long question of what this life was like, what it cost, what I thought it was going to become. She asked carefully, not poking at a wound but genuinely wanting to understand. She had a way of asking questions that made it clear she'd thought about it before she asked. She wasn't filling silence. She was actually trying to know something. I told her what I thought. I told her the honest version, not the version designed to make things sound better than they were or worse. I told her that I believed my people had a better chance than some thought, because they were adaptable, because they had always been adaptable, because that was the nature of Plains people. You move, you adjust. You find what the land is offering this season and you take it, and you don't mourn what last season offered because last season is finished. The ones who didn't understand that, I said, were the ones who had trouble. The ones who were waiting to go back to something, instead of moving forward into what was. She listened to all of it. When I was done, she said, "You believe that. It's not something you say for comfort." I try not to say things for comfort, I said. Comfort is for the short term. I'm interested in the long term. She looked at me. Something in her face that I couldn't quite read. She said, "My husband used to say that I asked too many questions, that I thought too much. He said a woman who thought too much was a problem waiting to happen." He was wrong, I said. She didn't respond to that, but the something in her face changed slight, like a breath released, like a small thing she'd been holding without knowing it. On the morning of the 5th day, I woke, and the wind was gone. Not quieter, gone, like a person who'd been shouting in the next room for 5 days and had simply stopped. The absence of it was louder than the sound had been, in a way. I lay there listening to nothing for a while. When I got up and opened the door, there was snow to the tops of my boots, hip-deep in the drift on the north side of the shelter. But the sky was clear, and the light was that particular quality that clear plains air gets in deep cold, brilliant and dimensionless, the kind of light that makes everything look closer than it is. It was still cold, cold enough to hurt your face in about 30 seconds, but the storm was done. She was awake and sitting up when I came back in, and she'd read it on my face. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," I said. "Today is for preparing. I'll pull the horses out, let them move, pack what we need." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You've been very kind." I said what I said. I said, "I gave you a room and a fire. You kept the fire alive. It about balanced out." She shook her head a little, not disagreeing exactly, more like setting that aside. She said, "You didn't have to take me in. You didn't know me. Some men would have looked at what showed up at their door and decided it was not their problem. You didn't. I know that's not a small thing." I didn't know what to say to that. I wasn't used to being seen that way. In straight terms, what I'd done laid out plainly like that. For a long time, people had looked at me and seen what I was in terms of what I could give them, what I could do, what danger or use I represented. My own people knew me, knew what I was, but they'd known me for years, grown into knowing me. What she'd done was different. She'd walked in near dead, and in 5 days she'd come to know what kind of man she was dealing with, and she'd said it out loud. I said, "My door was there. You were outside of it. There wasn't any decision to make." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "That's who you are." I didn't answer that, but I didn't look away either. We ate that morning in something close to comfortable silence, which is the best kind of silence, the kind where neither person feels the need to fill it, where the quiet is part of what's good about being in the room together. She made the coffee, having found where I kept it on the 2nd day. I made the meat. It was a meal about like all the other meals we'd had. Dried things and hot liquid, and something that wasn't fine by any standard, but was enough and warm. Joseph's thin horse came by that morning. He had a way of visiting that involved standing in the door and not really coming in, keeping one hand on the frame like he might leave at any moment, and saying everything he intended to say in about 6 words and then leaving. He looked at me, and he looked at the woman, and he said in Lakota that the horses were ready for a run, and that the North Trail was probably passable by late afternoon. I thanked him, he nodded and left. Clara said, "What did he say?" "That the horses are ready, and the trail will be clear by afternoon." He checked it himself, I'd guess. She looked at the door where the old man had been. "He did that for you." "He did it because it needed doing," I said. "That's how it works here." She turned and looked at me. "You've built that," she said. "People don't just become like that. Someone taught them or showed them by being that way themselves. You did that." I picked up the coffee cup. I said, "The people were already good. I just try not to make them worse." She smiled at that. A full one this time. It arrived and stayed. It changed her face considerably. She was not a woman who'd been doing much smiling, that was clear, not recently, but the apparatus was there, and when it came, it was real. "You're terrible at taking a compliment," she said. I said, "I've had limited practice." She laughed, short, genuine, surprised out of her. And then she put her hand over her mouth like she'd forgotten for a moment where she was and was getting her bearings back, and her eyes went a little bright, not quite tears, just the shine of something that had been pressing on her for a while and found a small release. We took the horses out in the early afternoon. I had two, my gray gelding Smoke and a brown mare I'd been using as a pack animal, sturdy if not fast. I showed Clara how to handle Smoke, who was opinionated but not dangerous once you understood his opinions. She'd ridden before, which helped. Not as much as she thought she had, but enough. We rode out through the camp, and I stopped to speak with two of the men about what would need doing with the snow around the shelters. And as we rode past Walking Alone's place, the old woman came out and stood in front of her door and looked at Clara. And Clara, on Smoke, said the Lakota greeting and something else I hadn't taught her, which turned out to be thank you. The thank you I had taught her but which she'd worked out how to fit into a sentence on her own. Walking Alone said something back. What did she say? Clara asked as we rode on. She said you are a person who knows how to be in a place. Clara was quiet for a while. Then she said, that might be the finest thing anyone has ever said to me. She meant it, I said. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean. We rode north. The plains after a deep cold storm have a particular quality. Everything is still, the way things are still only when they've been through something significant and are on the other side of it. The light has that crystal quality still, every shadow sharp and blue on the white, every rock and post and bare tree standing out with an exactness that the regular world doesn't usually have. Your horse's breath comes up in clouds. Your own breath comes up in clouds. The world is all white and blue, and the blue shadows of things. She was quiet for a long time as we rode. I didn't push conversation. The land was speaking if you wanted to hear it, and some people do and some people don't. She was one who did, I'd gathered. Around midday, I stopped at a place I knew, a south-facing cutbank where the snow wasn't too deep, and there was some dried grass the horses could get at. And we stopped and rested and ate the dried meat I'd brought, and she stood beside Smoke and looked out over the white plains and was quiet. Then she said, without looking at me, will you be all right when you go back? I said, when have I not been all right? I didn't mean it as an insult, she said. I meant, she thought for a moment. I meant that the room was a different thing with two people in it, and it'll be a different thing again when it goes back to one. I know something about that. I didn't want to not ask. I looked at the plains. The shadows of two cottonwoods fell blue across the snow. I said, I'll be all right. She turned and looked at me. She said, yes, I believe that. And then after a moment she said, you're a man who does what needs doing without asking to be seen for it. I've been watching that for 5 days. I want you to know that I saw it anyway, even if you didn't ask. The wind moved a little, just a small eddy, soft. The horses shifted. I said, Clara. She looked at me. I said, I'll be all right, but thank you for saying it. She nodded. She turned back to the plains and looked at them for another moment, and then she came and stood beside me, and she was close enough that her arm was against mine, both of us looking out at the same distance, and neither of us moved away from that. We rode on after a while. Faro Station was not much. It was a trading post and a blacksmith and a handful of buildings arranged without any plan along a creek, and in the winter it looked like what it was, which was people holding on in a hard place because they had decided to. Clara's aunt ran a boarding house on the East End, 2 stories, painted once and due for painting again, smoke coming good from the chimney, which was the important thing. We rode up to it in the late afternoon, the light already going thin and orange the way it does in winter on the plains when the sun gets low, and Clara's aunt, a woman built something like a general is built, came out of the door before we'd even stopped, and she looked at Clara the way a person looks at someone they thought they might not see again. They held each other a while. I stood at Smoke's head and waited. When they stepped back, Clara's aunt looked at me over Clara's shoulder. She was taking account of me the way Walking Alone had taken account of Clara, careful, thorough, a woman who'd seen things and wasn't easily fooled. She looked at me for a good 5 seconds. Then she nodded. One nod, deliberate. That was enough. Clara came to me. She stood in front of me with the last of the orange light on her face and the steam of her breath between us, and she said, "I know this is how it is. I know you're going back and I'm staying here, and that's right. That's what makes sense." She paused. "I want to know your name, your full name, your real name, not Running Elk, the one your mother used." I looked at her. I said, "No one has asked me that in a very long time." She waited. "Chayton," I said, "it means falcon." She said it once, quietly, like she was storing it. Then she reached up and put her hand on the side of my face. Her hand was cold and her eyes were steady, and she looked at me the way you look at something you are making sure you have in you, making sure you'll carry it. She said, "You are a good man, Chayton. I know that's not news to the people who know you, but I'm telling you anyway, because you need to hear it and because I need to say it." I put my hand over hers where it lay on my face, just for a moment. Then she stepped back. She said, "Thank you for the room, for the fire, for my feet." She almost smiled. "For the lard." "You fixed the fire," I said. "I've said that." "Goodbye, Chayton." "Goodbye, Clara Voss." She went inside with her aunt. The door closed, the light from inside going with it. I stood there another minute in the blue of the coming evening, smoke warm beside me, breathing his own clouds into the air, and I looked at the plains back the way I'd come, the long flat white going dark at the edges, the first star coming in the south. Then I turned and got on Smoke and rode for home. 2 days later, when I was back in the camp and back in my room and the fire was the way I had it, good and steady, no green wood left to argue with me, Joseph's thin horse appeared in the door the way he did. He looked at the room. He looked at me. He said in Lakota that the horses had looked good when I brought them in, and that the South Trail would be open again by spring, and that walking alone's hands were a little better now that the cold was easing some. I said thank you, and he nodded, and started to leave, and then he stopped with one hand on the frame the way he did, and he said, without turning back, that Clara Voss had been a person worth knowing. Then he left. I sat with that for a while. He wasn't wrong. I've been asked in the years since that winter what it was about those 5 days. What exactly happened in that room? I've said different things at different times, depending on who was asking and how much I wanted to say. But the truest version is this. A woman showed up at my door near dead, and I let her in because that's what you do, and in 5 days she showed me, without making a project of it, without sitting me down and announcing it, she showed me the things she saw. Not what she wanted me to be, what I was. She saw the man who'd kept that camp alive through 11 winters, who'd held 32 people together with a quiet authority they trusted without question, who'd kept the fire going all night every night even when it didn't want to be kept. And she put it in words, plain words, the way you'd name an object right there in front of you. That is a particular thing to be seen that way, not celebrated, not made into something large, just seen straight on for what you are. I'd forgotten what it felt like. I think about her sometimes when the fire wants to die on me and I have to crouch down and work at it, coaxing it along. I think about the lard trick and the way she held that cup, the way she said all right, the way she put her hand on my face and said a name that most people had forgotten I had. The fire in this room has been burning for a long time now, and I know how to keep it. That's not a small thing.